The music stopped the second his hand closed around her wrist. Elena Voss had been moving through the crowded ballroom for the last 3 hours, checking trays, adjusting lighting, whispering instructions into a small radio clipped to her waist. She was good at her job. She was good at being invisible. But invisibility ended the moment Dmitry Kovalenko rose from his chair at the head table, reached out, and pulled her down onto his lap in front of 200 guests. She did not scream. She did not pull away. She simply sat there, frozen, her heart slamming against her ribs, while every conversation in the room died at once. Nobody moved. Glasses of champagne hung in the air, halfway to open mouths. A waiter froze mid-step, a silver tray balanced on his palm. Even the string quartet in the corner let their bows drift to a stop, the last note fading into silence. Elena had taken this job 4 days earlier. A friend from the event planning agency had called her in a panic, saying a client needed a coordinator for a private party, last minute, and the pay was 3 times her normal rate. She had said yes, without asking too many questions. She needed the money. Her small apartment rent was due, her car needed new brakes, and her savings account had dropped low enough to keep her awake at night. The address she was given belonged to an enormous stone house on the edge of the city, surrounded by tall iron gates and old oak trees. When she arrived for the walkthrough, she noticed the men standing near the entrance. They wore dark suits, and their eyes moved differently than normal security guards. They watched everything. They watched everyone. She had asked her friend, quietly, whose party this was. Her friend had gone very still on the phone. Just do the job, Elena. Smile, get paid, and go home. Don't ask questions about the Kovalenko family. The name meant nothing to her at first. She was not from this city originally, and she had spent the last 2 years focused on rebuilding her career after a difficult divorce, not paying attention to whispered names in restaurants or hushed conversations at dinner parties. But over the next few days, as she prepared the guest list and coordinated with the household staff, she began to understand. People flinched when they said his name. Waiters lowered their voices. Even the florist who delivered the arrangements refused to meet her eyes when she mentioned who the party was for. Still, Elena told herself it did not matter. She was not part of that world. She was simply there to make sure the lighting was right, the food arrived on time, and the music matched the mood of the evening. In a few hours, she would collect her payment and go home to her small apartment, and none of this would ever touch her life again. That was what she told herself. On the night of the party, she arrived early, wearing a simple black dress that let her move quickly and blend into the background. The house had been transformed. Chandeliers sparkled above long tables covered in white linen. Candles flickered along every windowsill. The air smelled of roses and expensive wine. She was checking the seating arrangement near the head table when she felt someone watching her. She turned and found him standing only a few feet away. Dmitry Kovalenko was not what she expected. She had imagined someone loud, someone who filled a room with his presence the way people described powerful men in movies. Instead, he was quiet, tall, with dark hair combed back and sharp eyes that studied her without blinking. He wore a black suit with no tie, the top button of his shirt left open, and he carried himself with the kind of stillness that made people nervous without him saying a single word. "You're the coordinator," he said. It was not a question. "Yes, Elena Voss." She kept her voice steady, professional. "Everything is on schedule. Dinner will be served at 8. He studied her for a long moment, long enough that she felt her pulse quicken. "Good," he said finally, and walked away. She told herself that was the end of it. A brief exchange between an employer and an employee, nothing more. But as the party began, and guests filled the ballroom, she noticed him watching her from across the room more than once. Each time their eyes met, she looked away first, focusing on her clipboard, her radio, anything that gave her an excuse not to hold his gaze. The guests were unlike anyone she had worked with before. Men in tailored suits spoke in low voices, glancing over their shoulders even while laughing. Women in expensive jewelry moved carefully, as if the wrong word or the wrong glance could shift the mood of the entire room. There was an energy in the air that felt different from any party Elena had ever coordinated. Beneath the polished surface, something tense hummed just below the music. She kept working. She adjusted a flower arrangement that had tilted to one side. She signaled a waiter to refill glasses at the far table. She checked her watch and confirmed the dessert course would arrive on time. Every few minutes, without meaning to, she found herself glancing toward the head table, where Dmitri sat surrounded by men who leaned in close when he spoke, and laughed a little too quickly at his jokes. He rarely laughed himself. He watched the room the way a man watches a chessboard, calculating, patient, aware of every piece in play. Around 9 o'clock, a man approached her near the bar. He was younger than most of the other guests, with slicked hair and a confident smirk that made her uneasy the moment he opened his mouth. "You're new," he said, looking her up and down in a way that made her skin crawl. Dmitri hired well this time. Elena forced a polite smile. "I'm just the coordinator. Can I help you with something?" He laughed, low and unpleasant, and said something crude under his breath, something meant to embarrass her in front of the small group standing nearby. A few of them chuckled. Elena felt her face flush, but she held her composure, the way she had trained herself to do through years of managing difficult clients. She did not notice, at first, that Dmitri had gone still at the head table. She did not notice the way his jaw tightened, or the way his eyes fixed on the young man with a coldness that made the two guests standing closest to him take a small step back. What she noticed was the sudden silence. The young man's smirk faded as Dmitri rose from his seat. He crossed the room in a few unhurried steps, and the crowd parted for him without needing to be told. Conversations died mid-sentence. Even the musicians in the corner seemed to sense the shift, their playing growing softer until it stopped altogether. Elena stood frozen near the bar, unsure what was happening, unsure why every eye in the room had turned toward her. Dmitri did not look at the young man who had insulted her. He walked directly to Elena, reached out, and gently but firmly pulled her down onto his lap as he took his seat again at the head table. The room went completely silent. Nobody moved. Elena's heart pounded so hard, she was certain everyone could hear it. She felt the warmth of his hand resting lightly at her waist, steady, deliberate, nothing rushed about it. She did not know whether to feel afraid or protected. She only knew that every single person in that ballroom was staring at her, waiting to see what would happen next. Dmitri finally turned his head toward the young man who had spoken to her earlier. His voice, when it came, was calm, almost gentle, but there was something underneath it that made the young man's face lose all its color. "Apologize," Dmitri said simply. The young man stammered out an apology so fast his words nearly tripped over each other. He did not wait to be dismissed. He turned and walked quickly toward the far side of the room, disappearing into the crowd as though he wished the floor would swallow him whole. Elena sat there, on the lap of a man she had met only hours earlier, surrounded by 200 silent guests, and felt the entire world shift beneath her. She did not know, in that moment, that her life had just changed forever. She did not know that the quiet, careful world she had built for herself, the small apartment, the steady job, the routine she used to keep her thoughts from wandering into places she did not want them to go, was about to be pulled apart thread by thread. All she knew was the sound of her own heartbeat, the warmth of his hand at her waist, and the terrifying, undeniable realization that every person in that room now knew her name. The party ended 2 hours later, but for Elena, nothing about that night truly ended when the last guest walked out the door. She had spent the remaining hours on Dmitri's lap in a strange kind of daze, aware of every eye in the room even as conversation slowly resumed around them. Guests pretended not to stare, but she felt their glances like small pinpricks against her skin. Waiters moved a little more carefully near the head table. The musicians played softer songs, as though afraid to disturb whatever had just happened. Dmitri had said nothing more about the incident. He spoke with his guests, laughed quietly at a joke someone made about an old business deal, and occasionally leaned down to ask Elena if she needed anything, his voice low enough that only she could hear it. She answered in short, careful sentences, unsure of the rules of this strange new position she found herself in. When the party finally began winding down, guests offering their farewells and slipping out into the night, Dmitri rose from his chair and gently helped Elena to her feet. For a moment they stood there, close enough that she could see the faint lines at the corners of his eyes, the kind that came from years of careful thought rather than laughter. "Thank you for tonight," he said. "The party went well because of your work." Elena blinked, surprised by the simplicity of the compliment after everything that had happened. "I still have things to finish. The cleanup crew needs instructions, and I have to settle the final numbers with the caterer." "Take your time," he said, Someone will drive you home when you're finished. He walked away before she could respond, disappearing down a hallway with two of his men following close behind. Elena spent the next hour overseeing the cleanup, her mind racing even as her hands moved through familiar, practiced motions. She counted linens, checked leftover food for donation, confirmed payment details with the catering manager. It was easier to focus on numbers and lists than to think about what had happened at that table, in front of everyone. But she could not stop thinking about it. She kept replaying the moment his hand had closed around her wrist, the way the entire room had gone still, the fear and confusion, and strange flicker of safety she had felt sitting there, protected by a man the whole city seemed to fear. When she finally finished her work, one of Dimitri's men approached her near the entrance. He was older, with graying hair, and a calm, steady presence that reminded her of a soldier long retired from active duty, but still carrying himself with discipline. "Mr. Kovalenko would like a word before you leave," he said. Elena hesitated. Every instinct told her to simply walk out the door, find a taxi, and put this entire strange night behind her. But curiosity, and something else she did not want to name, kept her feet rooted in place. "All right," she said. The man led her through the house, past the now empty ballroom, down a quiet hallway lined with paintings that looked older than the city itself, until they reached a small study with a fireplace crackling softly in the corner. Dimitri stood near the window, his jacket removed, his sleeves rolled up to his forearms. He looked less like the composed host of a lavish party, and more like a tired man at the end of a long day. "Please, sit," he said, gesturing to a chair near the fire. Elena sat carefully, smoothing her dress, unsure of what to expect. "I owe you an explanation," Dimitri said, taking the chair across from her, "for what happened tonight." "You don't owe me anything," Elena said quickly. "I just want to understand what's happening. One moment I was doing my job, and the next, I was sitting in front of 200 people, and everyone looked at me like I had done something terrible." Dimitri studied her for a long moment before speaking. "The man who spoke to you earlier disrespected you in my house, in front of my guests. In my world, that cannot go unanswered. If I had let his words pass without consequence, it would have sent a message that anyone can treat the people under my roof however they please. I needed him, and everyone else in that room, to understand that would not be tolerated." "By pulling me onto your lap," Elena said, her voice quieter now. "It was not the way I would have chosen, if there had been time to think it through," he admitted. "But it was effective. Everyone in that room understood exactly what I meant." Elena studied him, trying to reconcile the calm, thoughtful man in front of her with the reputation that made grown men lower their voices at the mention of his name. "What exactly do you do, Mr. Kovalenko? People around this city speak your name like it's something dangerous." A faint, tired smile crossed his face. "I think you already know the answer to that question, Miss Voss. I think that's why you're still sitting in this chair instead of running for the nearest door." She did not have an answer for that. He was right, and they both knew it. "I run several businesses," he continued after a moment. "Some of them are exactly what they appear to be on paper. Others are more complicated. I inherited responsibilities from my father, responsibilities I did not choose but cannot walk away from. The people who work for me depend on me to keep order, to keep them safe, to keep the peace between families who would otherwise be at each other's throats." "That sounds like a lot of pressure for one person," Elena said quietly. "It is," he admitted, and for a brief moment, something flickered behind his eyes, something that looked almost like exhaustion. "Most people only see the reputation. They don't see the nights I spend awake, calculating every possible outcome of every decision, trying to keep the people around me from getting hurt." Elena did not know why, but she believed him. Perhaps it was foolish, perhaps it was dangerous, but there was something in the way he spoke, quiet and unguarded in this small study, that felt entirely different from the composed, controlled man who had commanded an entire ballroom into silence just hours earlier. "I should go home," she said finally, rising from her chair. "It's late, and I have other clients to prepare for this week." Dimitri stood as well. "Marco will drive you. It isn't safe for a woman to take a taxi alone this late at night, especially not after tonight." "I've taken taxis alone plenty of times," Elena said, a small smile tugging at the corner of her mouth despite everything. "Not after sitting on my lap in front of 200 people. he said, and for the first time that night, she saw something close to genuine humor in his expression. By morning, half this city will know your name. It's better if you're careful for a while. The words settled over her like a weight she had not expected. She had not considered what it might mean being seen the way she had been seen tonight, being marked, even accidentally, as someone connected to Dmitry Kovalenko. "What does that mean for me?" she asked, her voice quieter now, the fear returning in a slow, creeping wave. Dmitry's expression grew serious. "It means people will notice you. Some will be curious. Some will want to use you to get closer to me. And a few, the ones who wish me harm, might see you as a way to hurt me." Elena felt her stomach tighten. "That's not something I signed up for. I took a coordinating job. I wasn't supposed to become part of your world." "I know," Dmitry said, and there was something almost like regret in his voice. "And I intend to make sure nothing happens to you because of what occurred tonight. You have my word." "Your word," Elena repeated, unsure whether that meant anything at all in a world she barely understood. "In my world, Miss Voss, my word is the only thing that matters," he said simply. "It is the one thing I have never broken." Marco drove her home that night in a black car with tinted windows, the city lights blurring past as Elena stared out at the streets, her mind spinning with everything that had happened. When she finally reached her small apartment, she sat on her bed for a long time, still in her black dress, staring at nothing, trying to process how quickly her carefully ordered life had tilted sideways. She told herself she would finish this job, collect her payment, and never see Dmitry Kovalenko again. She told herself the strange warmth she had felt sitting on his lap, the strange safety in the middle of all that fear, meant nothing. But over the following days, she found herself thinking about him more than she wanted to admit. She noticed a black car parked across from her apartment building each morning, always a respectful distance away, never approaching, simply present. She realized, with a growing unease, that Dmitry had assigned someone to watch over her, exactly as he had promised. On the fourth day, a bouquet of white roses arrived at her apartment with no card, no name, nothing except the flowers themselves, left neatly on her doorstep. She stood in her hallway holding them, staring at the delicate white petals, and felt something she had not felt in a very long time. She felt curious. She felt drawn toward something she knew, deep down, she should be running from. Word had already begun to spread through the city, exactly as Dmitry had warned. A woman at the coffee shop she frequented gave her a strange, knowing look. A colleague from the events agency called to ask, in a careful, roundabout way, whether the rumors about the Kovalenko party were true. Elena deflected every question, insisting it had simply been a misunderstanding, a moment blown out of proportion by nervous party guests. But she knew, deep down, that nothing about that night had been a misunderstanding. She had been marked, whether she wanted it or not, and there was no undoing what had already been seen by 200 pairs of watching eyes. On the sixth day, as she left a client meeting downtown, a car pulled up beside her on the quiet street, its window rolling down slowly. She recognized the driver immediately. It was Dmitry himself, alone behind the wheel. No guards, no entourage, just him. "Get in," he said. "We need to talk." Elena stood frozen on the sidewalk, torn between every instinct telling her to walk away, and a growing, undeniable pull that told her this conversation had been coming since the moment his hand first closed around her wrist. She opened the door and got in. The car moved through the city slowly, neither of them speaking for the first few minutes. Elena sat with her hands folded tightly in her lap, watching the buildings slide past the window, waiting for Dmitry to explain why he had appeared on a quiet street corner, instead of sending a message through Marco or one of his other men. "You've been careful this week," Dmitry said finally, his eyes on the road. "No unnecessary trips, no late nights alone, I noticed." "You've been watching me," Elena said. "It was not really a question. I told you I would keep you safe." "That requires watching," he said simply. "There have been questions asked about you, people wanting to know who you are, why you were with me that night." Elena felt a chill crawl up her spine. "What kind of people?" Dmitry's jaw tightened slightly. "The kind who see any weakness as an opportunity. I have rivals in this city, Elena. Families who have wanted my position for a long time, who look for any crack they can use to their advantage. A woman connected to me, even by accident, becomes a target for questions, sometimes worse. You said I would be safe, she reminded him, trying to keep her voice steady despite the tightening in her chest. You are safe, he said firmly. That is why I am here. I need you to understand the situation fully, not through rumors or whispers, but from me directly. He pulled the car into a quiet parking area beside a small park near the edge of downtown, away from the busy streets, away from prying eyes. He turned off the engine and turned to face her fully for the first time since she had gotten into the car. There is a man named Victor Alexin, Dmitri said. His family has been rivals with mine for 2 generations. Where my father built his business through order and careful alliances, Victor's family built theirs through fear and unpredictability. We have maintained an uneasy peace for years, but peace like that is fragile. It only takes one incident, one perceived weakness, to unravel everything. And you think I could be that weakness, Elena said quietly. I think Victor will see an opportunity in you, Dmitri corrected. Not because of who you are, but because of what happened at that party. Everyone saw how I reacted when someone disrespected you. That tells him something about me he did not know before. It tells him I have a soft spot, something I have never shown publicly before. Elena felt her stomach twist with unease. So because you protected me, you've made yourself vulnerable. In this world, protection and vulnerability often look the same from a distance, Dmitri said, but I do not regret what I did. I would do it again. There was something in the quiet certainty of his voice that made Elena's chest tighten in an entirely different way, something warm mixed in with the fear. Why? She asked softly. Why would you put yourself at risk for someone you barely know? Dmitri was quiet for a long moment, his eyes searching her face, as though trying to decide how much to reveal. Because I am tired of a world where cruelty goes unanswered, simply because it is convenient to ignore it. Because in that moment, watching that man speak to you the way he did, I saw someone who deserved better than silence from everyone around her. Elena's throat tightened. She thought about all the years she had spent making herself small, agreeable, easy to overlook, first in her marriage, then in her career, always accommodating, always careful not to take up too much space. No one had ever stood up for her the way Dmitri had that night, not even the people who had claimed to love her. I don't know what to do with that, she admitted quietly. I don't know what to do with any of this. You don't have to decide anything right now, Dmitri said. I only wanted you to understand the truth, rather than hearing distorted versions from strangers on the street. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the park outside the window quiet and peaceful, children playing near a distant fountain, entirely unaware of the tension humming inside the parked car. Tell me about your father, Elena said eventually, curious despite herself. You said you inherited this life from him. Did you ever want something different? Dmitri's expression softened into something more distant, more reflective. When I was young, I wanted to be an architect. I used to draw buildings in the margins of my school notebooks, imagining structures that reached higher than anything in this city. My father found one of those notebooks when I was 14. He did not get angry. He simply sat me down and explained that dreams like that belonged to people who had the luxury of choice, and that I did not. That sounds lonely, Elena said softly. It was the reality I grew up with, Dmitri said. By the time I was 20, my father had passed the business to me, and I stopped drawing buildings. I started building something else instead, an organization that could protect the people who depended on it, that could bring order to chaos. Do you regret it? She asked. The life you have now? He considered the question carefully before answering. Some days, most days, I remind myself that the alternative, walking away entirely, would have left thousands of people without protection, without stability. It is not the life I would have chosen for myself, but it is the life I have learned to carry. Elena studied him in the quiet light filtering through the car window, seeing him differently than she had at the party, differently than the composed, controlled man who commanded silence with a single gesture. Here, in this quiet moment, he seemed almost ordinary, a man carrying weight he had never asked for, trying to do right by the people around him in whatever way he could. I should get back, she said eventually, glancing at the time. I have another meeting this afternoon. Dmitri nodded and started the car again, driving her the rest of the way to her next appointment without further conversation, though the silence between them now felt different than it had at the start of the drive. Less tense, more like two people who had shared something honest, even if neither of them fully understood what that honesty meant yet. Over the following weeks, Elena found herself drawn deeper into a strange, careful routine. Dmitri would occasionally appear at the edge of her daily life, never intrusive, never demanding, simply present. A coffee left at her office with her favorite order exactly right. A message checking that she had arrived home safely after a late meeting. Small gestures that spoke louder than any grand declaration could have. She told herself repeatedly that this was dangerous, that she was a coordinator who had accidentally stepped into a world she had no business being part of. But every warning she gave herself seemed to fade a little more each time she saw his name appear on her phone. Each time she found herself smiling at a simple message asking how her day had gone. Word around the city continued to spread, though slower now, quieter, as though people had grown tired of speculating, and simply accepted that Elena Voss had somehow become connected to Dmitri Kovalenko, whatever that connection truly meant. Then, 3 weeks after the party, everything shifted again. Elena was leaving her apartment building early one morning, coffee in hand, mind already occupied with the details of a wedding she was coordinating that weekend, when a man she did not recognize approached her on the sidewalk. He was well-dressed, calm, with an unsettling smile that did not reach his eyes. "Miss Voss," he said, his accent thick and unfamiliar. "My employer would like a moment of your time." Elena's heart began to race. "I don't know who your employer is, and I'm late for a meeting." "Victor Alexin sends his regards," the man said, and Elena felt every ounce of blood drain from her face. "He simply wants to talk, nothing more." Elena glanced around the quiet street, searching for the black car she had grown accustomed to seeing parked nearby, the one Dmitri had assigned to watch over her. It was nowhere in sight. "I don't have anything to say to Mr. Alexin," Elena said, trying to keep her voice steady despite the fear rising in her chest. The man's smile widened slightly. "That is unfortunate, because Mr. Alexin is very interested in learning more about the woman who has captured Dmitri Kovalenko's attention so thoroughly. He believes you might be exactly the kind of person who could help bring some much-needed change to this city." "I'm not interested in your city's politics," Elena said firmly, stepping back toward her apartment building. "Please leave, or I'll call the police." The man laughed softly, an unpleasant sound that sent a chill down her spine. "The police in this city understand very well which families to avoid, Miss Voss. But I will leave you with this thought. Loyalty to Dmitri Kovalenko is not the safest position to hold right now. Things are shifting. It would be wise to consider where your interests truly lie, before it is too late to choose." He turned and walked away, disappearing around the corner as quickly and calmly as he had appeared, leaving Elena standing frozen on the sidewalk, her coffee forgotten, her hands trembling. She called Dmitri the moment she reached the safety of her apartment lobby, her voice shaking as she recounted every detail of the encounter. Within minutes, a car arrived outside her building, and Marco escorted her upstairs, standing guard outside her door while she tried to steady her breathing. Dmitri arrived 20 minutes later, his expression darker than she had ever seen it, a controlled fury simmering beneath his calm exterior. "He approached you directly," Dmitri said, his voice low and tight. "That means he is done being patient. He is testing how far he can push before I respond." "What does that mean for me?" Elena asked, still trembling from the encounter. Dmitri crossed the room and knelt beside her chair, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "It means I made a mistake keeping you at arm's length these past weeks, trying to protect you by keeping some distance between us. That distance did nothing except leave you exposed. From now on, things need to change." "Change how?" she asked, though some part of her already suspected the answer. "You need protection close enough that Victor understands, without question, that harming you means declaring open conflict with everything I have built," Dmitri said. "I should have done this from the very beginning." Elena studied his face, searching for any sign of hesitation, but found none. "And if I don't want to be pulled deeper into this world, if I just want to go back to my quiet life, coordinating parties and weddings, staying far away from families like Alexin and Kovalenko entirely." Something flickered across Dmitri's expression, something that looked almost like pain. "Then I will do everything in my power to make that possible for you, even if it means staying away from you myself. Your safety matters more to me than anything I might want." The room fell silent. the weight of his words settling heavily between them. Elena realized, in that moment, that she had reached a crossroads she had not expected to face so soon, a decision that would shape everything that came next in her life, whether she was ready for it or not. Elena did not sleep that night. She lay awake in her bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying the conversation with the stranger on the sidewalk over and over in her mind, along with the quiet, painful honesty in Dimitri's voice when he offered to walk away entirely, if it meant keeping her safe. By morning, she had made a decision, though it was not the one she expected to make when she first went to bed. She called Dimitri before she had even finished her first cup of coffee. "I don't want you to walk away," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I want to understand what protection actually looks like, if I choose to stay close to you. I need to know what I would be agreeing to." There was a brief pause on the other end of the line, as though her words had caught him off guard. "Are you certain? Once you understand the full picture, there is no easy way to step back from it." "I'm certain," Elena said, and found, to her own surprise, that she meant it. Dimitri arranged for her to meet him that afternoon, at a quiet restaurant, on the outskirts of the city, away from the more visible parts of town, a place where conversations could happen without curious eyes, watching from every direction. When Elena arrived, she found him already seated at a corner table, a folder of papers set neatly beside his plate. "I want to be completely honest with you," Dimitri said, once she had settled into her seat. "Not just about the danger, but about everything. You deserve to make this decision with full knowledge, not partial truths." Over the next 2 hours, Dimitri explained the structure of his world, in careful, measured detail. He spoke of the businesses that operated in plain sight, restaurants and shipping companies, and construction firms that provided honest work to thousands of employees across the city. He spoke, more carefully, of the other operations that existed beneath the surface, the agreements between families that kept certain territories peaceful, the delicate balance of power that had held for years, now threatened by Victor Alexin's growing ambition. "Victor believes the old agreements are outdated," Dimitri explained. "He wants more territory, more control over certain trade routes that currently belong to neutral parties. My father spent decades building alliances to prevent exactly the kind of conflict Victor seems eager to start. And you think he's using me to provoke you into something reckless?" Elena said, piecing together the situation slowly. "I think he's testing multiple pressure points at once," Dimitri said. "You are simply one of them, but you are the one I care most about protecting." Elena studied the folder of papers beside his plate, curiosity getting the better of her. "What's that?" Dimitri hesitated for a moment before sliding it across the table toward her. "Information about the security arrangements I intend to put in place around you, if you agree to stay close. Drivers, a revised schedule for your work commitments, contact protocols in case of emergency. I wanted you to see exactly what this would look like before asking you to agree to anything." Elena opened the folder and looked through the pages, her chest tightening at the seriousness of it all, the detailed plans for keeping her safe from a danger she had never imagined touching her ordinary life. It felt surreal, reading about security protocols and emergency contacts, as though she had somehow become a person important enough to require them. "This is a lot," she admitted quietly. "It is," Dimitri agreed, "and I understand if it feels overwhelming. You did not ask for any of this when you took the coordinating job 3 weeks ago." "No," Elena said, closing the folder gently. "But I'm here now, and running away doesn't feel like it would actually keep me safe. It just feels like delaying the same problem." Dimitri watched her carefully, something like admiration flickering across his features. "You're stronger than most people who find themselves suddenly caught in this world." "I don't feel strong," Elena admitted. "I feel terrified most of the time." "Strength isn't the absence of fear," Dimitri said quietly. "It's choosing to move forward despite it." Over the following weeks, Elena's life settled into a new, careful rhythm. A driver picked her up each morning and dropped her off each evening, always polite, always professional, never intrusive into her work or her personal decisions. Marco checked in periodically, a steady, reassuring presence that gradually began to feel less like surveillance and more like genuine care. And Dimitri himself became a more consistent presence in her days, not overwhelming, not demanding, but steady. They would meet for dinner occasionally, quiet conversations in private corners of restaurants, talking about everything from his childhood memories of drawing buildings to her own dreams of one day opening her own event planning company instead of working for someone else's agency. She learned that he read history books late into the night when he could not sleep, that he had a soft spot for old jazz records, that he still remembered the names of every employee who had worked in his father's original restaurant decades earlier. Slowly, carefully, the reputation that had once made grown men lower their voices began to feel less like the whole truth and more like a single piece of a much more complicated person. But the danger never fully faded into the background. Twice more, Elena noticed unfamiliar faces watching her from across the street, gone before she could get a clear look. Once, a delivery arrived at her office with no return address, containing nothing but a single black rose and a note that read simply, "Choose wisely." Each incident sent Dmitri's security measures tightening further, each one a reminder that Viktor Aleksin had not given up his efforts to use her as leverage against the man who had, without either of them fully planning it, become deeply important to her. One evening, nearly 2 months after the party that had started everything, Dmitri invited Elena to his home for dinner, a quiet, private evening away from restaurants and public eyes. She arrived to find the house transformed from the grand, crowded venue she remembered from that first chaotic night into something warmer, more intimate, candles lit in the smaller dining room rather than the enormous ballroom where everything had begun. "This feels different," Elena said, glancing around the quiet space. "This is the house the way it actually feels most nights," Dmitri said, pulling out her chair for her. "The party you attended was an exception, not the rule." They ate dinner slowly, the conversation easy and comfortable, in a way that would have seemed impossible to Elena just 2 months earlier, back when the mere mention of Dmitri Kovalenko's name had been enough to make her friend go silent with fear over the phone. After dinner, they walked together through the quiet garden behind the house, the night air cool and still around them. "I need to tell you something," Dmitri said eventually, stopping near a stone bench beneath a large oak tree. "Viktor has requested a meeting, a formal one, between our families, to discuss the terms of a new agreement." Elena felt her stomach tighten. "Is that dangerous?" "Any meeting with Viktor carries risk," Dmitri admitted, "but refusing the meeting entirely would be seen as weakness, an invitation for him to escalate further." "I have to attend." "When?" Elena asked, trying to keep her voice steady. 3 days from now," Dmitri said. "I wanted you to hear it from me directly, rather than through rumors or whispers around the city." Elena reached out and took his hand, an instinctive gesture that surprised them both. "Will you be safe?" "I intend to be," Dmitri said, though his voice carried a weight that told her the outcome was far from guaranteed. "These meetings follow careful rules, agreed upon by all the families years ago. Neutral ground, no weapons, witnesses from every side to ensure fairness. It is the safest way to resolve disputes, without descending into open conflict. But Viktor doesn't seem like the kind of man who respects rules," Elena said quietly. "No," Dmitri agreed, "which is exactly why I need to be careful." They stood together beneath the oak tree for a long moment, neither speaking, the weight of the coming meeting settling heavily over the peaceful evening. Elena thought about everything that had changed since that first night at the party. How quickly and completely her life had become intertwined with this man's world, this world of careful negotiations and hidden dangers, of loyalty and fear existing side by side. "I want to be there," Elena said suddenly, surprising herself with her own words. "At the meeting, or nearby at least, somewhere I can know what's happening." Dmitri shook his head immediately. "Absolutely not. It's too dangerous. If anything went wrong, if Viktor saw an opportunity to use your presence against me." "I'm not asking to walk into the room with you," Elena said, cutting him off gently. "I'm asking not to be left in the dark, wondering, terrified, while you face something this serious. I've spent the last 2 months learning to live in your world. Let me actually be part of it, instead of watching from a safe distance every time something important happens." Dmitri studied her for a long moment, something shifting behind his eyes, an internal battle between his instinct to protect her completely and his growing respect for her refusal to be sidelined. "I'll think about it," he said finally, though the tone of his voice suggested he already knew he would eventually agree. The 3 days leading up to the meeting passed in a tense blur of preparation. Dmitri spent long hours in meetings with his closest advisors, reviewing terms, anticipating Viktor's demands, preparing counterproposals designed to protect the fragile peace his father had spent decades building. Elena continued her work, coordinating events during the day, but her evenings were spent at Dimitri's house, listening quietly as he and his advisors discussed strategy, learning more about the delicate political landscape that governed this hidden world beneath the surface of the city she thought she knew. On the night before the meeting, Dimitri found her sitting alone in the garden, staring up at the stars, unable to sleep despite the late hour. "Whatever happens tomorrow," he said, sitting down beside her, "I need you to know that meeting you at that party was not a mistake, even with everything it has brought into your life since." Elena turned to look at him, searching his face in the dim light. "I don't regret it either. Even with all the fear, all the uncertainty, I don't regret any of it." Dimitri reached out and gently took her hand, his fingers warm against hers. "Whatever tomorrow brings, I intend to come back to you. I need you to hold on to that." "I will," Elena whispered, though the uncertainty of everything that lay ahead pressed heavily against her chest. Neither of them could have known, sitting together beneath the quiet stars that night, just how close tomorrow's meeting would come to shattering everything they had carefully built together. The meeting took place at a hotel conference room on neutral ground, chosen years earlier by an agreement between all the major families in the city, a space belonging to no one, controlled by no single organization, watched over by trusted witnesses from every side. Elena waited 3 blocks away, sitting in a quiet cafe with Marco stationed nearby, her phone clutched tightly in her hand, waiting for any word of what was happening behind those closed doors. Dimitri had agreed, after much discussion, to let her be close, though not present, a compromise that satisfied neither of them completely, but felt, at least, like a step forward from being left entirely in the dark. Inside the conference room, Dimitri sat across a long table from Victor Alexin, for the first time in nearly 2 years. Victor looked exactly as Dimitri remembered, silver hair combed back neatly, sharp eyes that missed nothing, a smile that never quite reached the rest of his face. "Dimitri," Victor said warmly, though the warmth felt as artificial as everything else about him. "It has been too long." "Victor," Dimitri replied, his voice calm and controlled, despite the tension coiled tightly in his chest. "Let's discuss why you requested this meeting." Victor's smile widened slightly. "Straight to business. I always admired that about you, even when we were young men learning this world from our fathers." Over the next hour, Victor laid out his demands with careful, practiced precision. He wanted access to 2 trading routes currently controlled by neutral parties, routes that Dimitri's father had spent years negotiating, to keep free from any single family's control. He wanted a reduction in tariffs on shipments passing through Kovalenko territory. He wanted, essentially, a complete restructuring of the careful balance that had kept the city's underground economy stable for over a decade. "These terms would destabilize everything my father built," Dimitri said, keeping his voice steady despite the anger simmering beneath the surface. "You know that. Your father built a system designed to keep his own family comfortable, while the rest of us fought over scraps," Victor said, his tone shifting subtly, the warmth draining away to reveal something colder underneath. "I am simply asking for fairness." "You're asking for control," Dimitri corrected. "There is a difference." The conversation grew tenser as the minutes passed, both men carefully measuring every word, every gesture, aware that any wrong move could shift the fragile atmosphere of the room into something far more dangerous. Witnesses from 3 other families sat silently along the walls, watching, ready to report back to their own organizations about how this critical negotiation unfolded. "I have heard," Victor said suddenly, shifting the conversation in an unexpected direction, "that you have taken a particular interest in a young woman recently. An event coordinator, I believe." Dimitri's expression did not change, though his hand tightened almost imperceptibly against the arm of his chair. "That has nothing to do with the terms we are here to discuss, doesn't it?" Victor said, leaning back in his chair with a satisfied expression. "A man's priorities reveal a great deal about his weaknesses. I find it interesting that the great Dmitri Kovalenko, so careful, so controlled for years, would suddenly risk exposing himself over a woman he barely knows." "Leave her out of this conversation," Dimitri said, his voice low and dangerous now, all pretense of calm negotiation beginning to crack. Victor smiled, clearly pleased at having found a nerve worth pressing. I only mention it because it occurs to me that a man with something precious to protect might be more willing to negotiate reasonably, rather than clinging stubbornly to outdated agreements his father made decades ago. The threat, though never spoken directly, hung heavily in the air, unmistakable to everyone in the room. Dmitri felt every instinct in his body demanding he respond with force, but he forced himself to remain still, remembering the careful rules of this meeting, remembering that any breach of protocol would only give Victor exactly the justification he seemed to be searching for. If anything happens to her, Dmitri said quietly, each word measured and deliberate, there will be no negotiation left to have, only consequences. The room fell utterly silent, the witnesses along the walls exchanging careful glances, aware that the conversation had shifted into territory far more serious than trade routes and tariffs. Victor studied Dmitri for a long moment, something calculating behind his eyes, before finally leaning back and allowing a small, satisfied smile to cross his face. Of course, I would never suggest such a thing directly. I am simply pointing out that we all have things we value, Dmitri. Perhaps it would be wise for both of us to consider what we stand to lose before this conversation continues. The meeting continued for another hour, tense and careful, both men retreating slightly from the sharpest edges of the conversation, aware that the presence of the witnesses meant word of any serious threat would spread quickly through every family in the city. By the end, no formal agreement had been reached, but both sides had agreed to reconvene in 2 weeks, giving each family time to consider the terms more carefully. When Dmitri finally left the conference room, his expression carefully composed for the benefit of the witnesses still watching, he found Marco waiting near the entrance with an update on Elena's location. He walked quickly to the small cafe 3 blocks away, his heart still pounding from the tension of the meeting, and found her sitting exactly where he had left her, her face lighting up with relief the moment she saw him walk through the door. "You're okay," she said, rising quickly from her chair. "I'm okay," Dmitri confirmed, though the tightness in his voice told her the meeting had not gone smoothly. They left the cafe together, and once safely inside the car, away from prying eyes, Dmitri finally allowed himself to relax slightly, though the tension from the meeting still lingered heavily around him. "Victor mentioned you," he said quietly, once they were driving. "He used you as leverage, trying to pressure me into agreeing to his terms." Elena felt a chill run through her, despite the warmth of the car. "What did you say?" "I told him that if anything happened to you, there would be no negotiation left to have," Dmitri said, his jaw tight. "I should not have said that. It was a mistake, letting my emotions show so clearly in front of witnesses. Or, it was the truth," Elena said softly, "and sometimes the truth is worth more than careful diplomacy." Dmitri glanced at her, something shifting in his expression. "You're not upset that I put myself at risk defending you?" "I'm terrified," Elena admitted, "but I'm not upset. I understand now, more than I did before, exactly what kind of man you are, and I don't think that man could have said anything different in that moment." Over the following 2 weeks, security around Elena tightened even further, extra precautions taken at every turn, extra eyes watching every street corner near her apartment and office. The tension in the city grew palpable, whispers spreading through every corner of the underground world about the confrontation between Kovalenko and Alexin, about the woman who had somehow become central to the conflict between 2 powerful families. Elena found herself growing more confident despite the danger, more willing to ask questions, more willing to understand the intricate politics of the world she had been pulled into. She began attending some of Dmitri's smaller meetings, listening carefully, offering occasional insights from her own experience, navigating difficult clients, and delicate negotiations in her own line of work. Dmitri found himself increasingly relying on her calm, practical perspective, a fresh viewpoint unclouded by decades of underground politics and old grudges. 3 days before the scheduled second meeting with Victor, everything changed unexpectedly. Elena was working late at her office, finalizing details for an upcoming wedding, when Marco appeared at her door, his expression grave. "We need to leave now," he said. "Dmitri's orders." "What's happening?" Elena asked, already gathering her things, sensing the urgency in his voice. "Victor has made his move," Marco said grimly. "Not against Dmitri directly, against one of the neutral trade routes, seizing control by force, breaking the terms of the old agreement entirely." Elena felt her stomach drop. What does that mean for the meeting? For Dmitri? It means the peace your presence in this city was supposed to help protect is falling apart, Marco said, and Dmitri needs to respond, quickly, before Victor's actions destabilize everything further. They arrived at Dmitri's house to find it filled with tense activity, advisors moving quickly between rooms, phones ringing constantly, the atmosphere entirely different from the quiet, warm evenings Elena had grown accustomed to over the past 2 months. She found Dmitri in his study, surrounded by maps and documents, his expression harder and more focused than she had ever seen it. Victor broke the agreement, he said without looking up as she entered. He's forcing my hand. What are you going to do? Elena asked, moving carefully into the room. Dmitri finally looked up, meeting her eyes with an intensity that made her breath catch. I'm going to do what my father would have done. I'm going to remind Victor exactly why the old families respected the agreements in the first place. Without violence, Elena said quickly, fear rising in her chest. Please, tell me there's another way. There is, Dmitri said, though the weight in his voice suggested the path ahead would not be easy. But it requires every family in this city to remember why unity mattered more than individual ambition. It requires calling in favors, alliances built over decades, reminding Victor that acting alone against everyone else carries consequences far greater than he anticipated. Over the following days, Elena watched as Dmitri worked tirelessly, meeting with representatives from every major family in the city, carefully rebuilding the coalition his father had originally established, reminding old allies of shared history and mutual benefit. She saw a side of him she had never fully appreciated before, not the cold, calculating figure the city whispered about, but a patient, determined leader working to protect a fragile peace through diplomacy rather than force. Slowly, methodically, family by family, Dmitri secured commitments of support, isolating Victor's position until the other families made clear, through carefully worded messages and quiet meetings, that his actions would not be tolerated without consequence. 2 weeks after seizing control of the trade route, Victor found himself standing virtually alone, the other families having united firmly behind Dmitri's leadership rather than risk the chaos Victor's ambition threatened to unleash. Faced with the unified opposition of every other family in the city, Victor had little choice but to relinquish control of the trade route and agree to the original terms of the old agreement, his ambitions checked, at least for now, by the very system he had tried to destabilize. The final resolution came not through confrontation, but through a quiet meeting between the family representatives, Victor forced to acknowledge, publicly, that his actions had overstepped the boundaries the families had agreed upon generations earlier. It was not the dramatic victory some had expected, but it was, in its own careful way, exactly the kind of resolution Dmitri's father would have been proud of. Months later, on a quiet evening in early autumn, Elena stood once again in the garden behind Dmitri's house, the same garden where they had once sat together beneath the stars, waiting anxiously for news of a dangerous meeting. This time, there was no tension in the air, no fear pressing against her chest, only peace, hard-won and carefully maintained. Dmitri found her there, watching the sunset paint the sky in soft shades of orange and gold. "You've changed this house," Elena said, smiling as he approached. "It feels different than it did that first night." "You changed it," Dmitri said, taking her hand gently. "Everything feels different because of you." Elena thought back to that terrifying, transformative night at the party, the moment his hand had closed around her wrist, the silence that had fallen over the entire ballroom, as every guest waited to see what would happen next. She had walked into that party as an invisible coordinator, focused entirely on staying out of sight, avoiding attention at all costs. She had walked out of it, eventually, as someone entirely different, someone who had learned to stand firm in the face of fear, someone who had found unexpected strength in a world that had once terrified her completely. "I never could have imagined this," she admitted, leaning against him as the sun continued its slow descent toward the horizon. "Not in 1,000 years." "Neither could I," Dmitri said softly, "but I am grateful, every single day, that it happened exactly the way it did." Together, they watched the last light fade from the sky, two people who had found each other in the most unexpected of circumstances, bound together not by the danger and fear that had once surrounded them, but by something far stronger, something that had grown quietly and steadily through every challenge they had faced side by side. The city continued on around them, unaware of how close its careful balance had come to shattering completely, unaware of the quiet courage of one woman who had refused to run when everything in her life told her to. And in the garden behind the house where it had all begun, Elena Voss finally understood that sometimes the most frightening moments in life lead to the most unexpected and enduring kind of peace.